Welcome inside the SB Nation studios in New York City. I'm Ariel Helwani. This is a brand new web series from MMAfighting.com called the MMA Beat. We're going to bring together some of the top journalists in the sport of MMA, covering the sport on the MMA Beat to talk about the MMA Beat. And today we're being joined by two of the best in the business, Mike Chiappetta of MMAfighting.com and Luke Thomas, also of MMAfighting.com. I don't call them the best in the business just because we all work together. They're actually pretty good at what they do. Guys, great to do this. I've always been a big fan of these sports reporters on some cable network that's based out of Connecticut.
Never heard of it. She'll have no name.
Exactly. And this is sort of the MMA version of that. I'm very excited about this. Let's start. Obviously, this is a big year for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Prior to this year, UFC President Dana White said that the next 2 years will be bigger than the last 10 as far as his reign as president of the UFC. We are approaching the fourth quarter of year one. It's been a roller coaster ride for the UFC thus far. Luke, let's start with you. How would you grade the first 3 quarters of 2012?
Noting, of course, that the final grade after the full year is the one that probably matters the most. The initial grade is probably not that good. C-, D+, somewhere around there. Now, reasons for a couple here. One, things beyond their control. It seems like the moving away from Spike to the Fox platform and the number of new shows, it wasn't just a lot of new challenges, it was a complete paradigm shift. And in that paradigm shift, the number of talented fighters grew, but they took on a challenge with these Fox shows and these Fuel shows and these FX shows and these expanded pay-per-view schedule. I know it was down from 16 down to 14, but still, in addition to all those Fox platforms, that it even outstripped the amount of talent that they have. It was like they bought shoes a little too big for themselves, and they're still growing into it. So I think down the line, I see a lot of potential for a lot of great mixed martial arts, and I think that the brand will be better than ever. But given the injuries that they had, this new normal of unbelievable decline, the ability to produce the cards they want, and also I think they kind of overestimated their strength agreeing to put on all those shows. So between those two problems, it hasn't been the best year. But again, I will say the first year matters, and it's a 7-year deal.
That is true.
Yeah, I think it's a little too early to give them a grade. I think, if anything, you'd have to give them an incomplete here if it was sort of a grading on a college basis. They've had so many issues and problems. You know, we talked a lot about injuries over the course of the last few months. They've had so many guys that have been out, headlining guys, you know, important guys who are going to be at the top of the card and help jack up the pay-per-view buy rates. As Luke said, they have that expanded schedule, 34 events this year. For the first time in UFC history, most of those events are actually on free TV or on Fox and FX and Fuel, which obviously is actually good for the fans. It's just less money out of your pockets. If you do want to watch just MMA for free, you can pretty much get a full year schedule out of it if you compare it to years past. So I think they're doing some good things. At the same time, the events that they have put on, certainly there has been a lack of quality at the top of cards to make compelling cases for really stacked events. You know, fans like to see, 3 big fights at the top of a card. You can't do that every time out, but we'd like to see it more often than not, especially when you want to plunk down $55. When that's a decision that you're making, I think you would like to see bigger, more stacked cards. I think you have to say it's incomplete.
Let me just say though, don't get me wrong, at this point should be noted, and there's no arguing with it. Relative to the UFC roster 2 years ago, 4 years ago, it's undeniable. There is more talent than ever. I mean, Kevin the Fire Burns used to be a relatively top welterweight. That is not the case anymore. But sort of here's the problem.
Poor Kevin Burns.
Kevin, I know, but I don't listen. The guy was a bank teller who was part-time as an MMA fighter. That's worth noting, right?
Right.
But here's sort of my issue. When was the last time, and it's not meant as a slight, but when was the last time someone honestly said to you, you know what we don't have enough of? UFC shows. I just can't get enough of that. You've never heard that. You've never heard that. And I think as the evidence of that, name 2 fights from the undercard of UFC and FX3. I can't do it, but I can tell you that there's a legion of MMA fans who can recite to the records of even minor guys like Fabiano Iha, who fought in a different era of the UFC. So my point is, there is a lot to work with, but this bloated roster of 400 guys, I'm not sure that the product can't be better if it's more streamlined. I think there's a good argument to be made there.
But isn't that all part of the growing pains of the sport? I mean, this is a whole new era, moving into Fox and broadcast television for the first time, this expanded schedule. I mean, there are things that they've never experienced before. We have to give them some level of flexibility in terms of learning these things that they're doing and adjusting in the future. To judge them in the first year, I think, is a little bit unfair. Obviously, listen, this is an industry and a world where you have to have immediate results, but they do have a 7-year deal. Fox is not going to cancel them after 1 year. No. You have to give them a little bit of time to adjust to all these new changes that are occurring.
And last thing, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, buddy. This is working out well for Fox. It should be noted there. Fuel ratings higher than they've ever been. FX, certainly in those male demos, they're winning on Friday night, even with the lower ratings for Ultimate Fighter. And listen, the last couple events on Fox have been, not the best ones ever, but the first two were huge, and it looks like they're going to have a major rebound for the 5th show. So it should be noted, while UFC is still trying to adjust, Fox is doing well here.
Carlos Eduardo Rocha versus Mike Pierce and Seth Baczynski versus
Oh, you got me!
2 undercard
You got me, you got me.
UFC on FX3.
When you threw out that challenge, I had a feeling he was digging in there.
Okay, but you see my point.
I do see your point. But here's the fascinating part of year one. The next, 4 months or so, 3.5 months, all could be forgotten in my opinion. If the 4 pay-per-views and the Fox show that you bring up, UFC on FX5, delivers, and everyone who's supposed to fight on those cards actually fights. Look at 152. You got Jon Jones coming back, fighting Vitor Belfort. Flyweight title, Bisping Stanton. 153, Frankie Edgar versus Jose Aldo, a super fight a lot of people have been asking for. 154, the return of GSP. 155, JDS versus K2, Chael Sonnen versus Forrest Griffin. If those 4 pay-per-view fights and the Fox 5 actually happens and the guys are actually healthy and they actually, put on the cards that they want to, in my opinion, everyone will forget what happened in the last 9 months.
Yeah, I think luck plays a part in some of these things. These guys getting hurt, and Dan Henderson getting hurt 2 weeks before the fight. Does that sort of thing happen? Yes, but I don't think it happens in the frequency that we've seen this year as far as, major injuries and guys going down. And basically lost George St. Pierre for the whole year. He's not been available.
Devastating.
Yeah, this guy's probably their biggest pay-per-view draw. He's finally going to be available in November. That's going to be probably one of the biggest buy rates of the year. All these injuries and things, with a little bit of luck, they're going to have a stretch now where guys don't get hurt, or maybe they get hurt, 8 weeks ahead of time, and there's plenty of time to replace it with a much better fight than was originally planned. So at some point, luck is going to rebound in their favor. It's kind of a law of averages thing.
True, and they had a lot of luck at the right moments as they grew on the Spike platform earlier in their year. All I want to say is, look, you can make a case. Let's say you had this past year, and there were no injuries. Now, I know that's not realistic, but let's just say, look at the cards they had. You can make a case that would be like the best year ever in mixed martial arts.
Ever.
But my only point is, listen, that irrespective, did the UFC slightly overestimate the strength of their roster when they agreed to all those shows plus the pay-per-views? I would argue that they did.
Yeah, and they're certainly putting on a lot of shows right now, and I guess calling yourself a UFC fighter, as you sort of pointed out, isn't what it once was. There are a lot more UFC fighters now, and there are more fighters on the roster than ever before. The next event for the UFC is UFC 152. This event has obviously changed a lot, and I know I said this on the MMA Hour on Monday. I'm so sick. Actually, it was on Wednesday this week. I am so sick of talking about UFC 151 and the cancellation of it, but I don't think that story is going to go away until UFC 152 is in the books.
Right.
It's part of that story. What I think is so fascinating about the Jon Jones story is a lot of people are talking about Jon Jones, the PR nightmare that is Jon Jones, how he needs a publicist. He reportedly fired his publicist, John Fuller, and he's making so many mistakes in the public eye. Why does Jon Jones need a publicist? That's what I want to know. Did Mike Tyson need a publicist? Why do we want our fighters to be...
probably could have benefited from a publicist.
Why do we want our fighters to be Alex Rodriguez? No. Why do we want them to be packaged? Why are media people actually calling out Jon Jones and saying, no, we want you to be more tame. We want you to be more vanilla. I want him to screw up. I want him to say what's on his mind. I want him to say these things that may not be PC. Calling Dan Henderson an old guy, saying that that's the reason why his bum knee. That's interesting. That's the fight game. I don't understand why the media is almost forcing Jon Jones to go into this package that we were actually criticizing him of going down that path just a year ago.
I'm certainly not a person that's brought this up, except when people bring it up to us. People say, what's this guy's problem, or why is he like them? Listen, it's all perception. I think those of us who had a chance to spend a little bit of time around Jon Jones, we kind of perceive him a lot differently than the fans do,
absolutely,
I think.
Absolutely.
Huge gap. Yeah, and it's just not something that translates to the fans for some reason. I agree with you. I like this sport being the way it is. It's obviously great for us. It's not great for Jon Jones. It's not great for the sport in a sense, because Jon Jones is the guy that's going to be the face of MMA for probably years to come. He's that good. He's that young. And as long as he keeps his head on straight, he is going to be winning and at the top for a long time. He's the guy that brought Nike into the sport and probably will have them expand into the sport. So it is better for the sport to have a scrub down Jon Jones. Now the question for me, the media need to be rooting for the sport. I don't see that being our place. I mean,
no, not at all.
It's our job to kind of report on what's happening. Yes, certainly it is our job to criticize him when he does things incorrectly, or to, give him the praise that he deserves when he performs the way he does in the cage. But aside from that, it's not our place for him to offer him PR guidance. Although I agree with you that we've seen a lot of journalists and reporters kind of offering that advice.
We have, and I've been one of them. Although I think he's been improperly slandered. I took quite publicly Jon Jones' side in this dispute. But irrespective of that, for every Pacquiao, you do have your Mayweather, a guy who gives double gun middle fingers to everyone and doesn't care what you think. Will beat up his wife and then claim or his baby's mother, and then claim in jail he can't live in these inhumane North Korean conditions. It comes out looking jacked. This guy is he's a terrible person. Okay, that's just the reality of it.
How did we get on the Floyd?
Here's my point. My point is that he is still able to use all of this and become an unbelievable star.
Right.
But the truth is, I think all things being equal, it's better to be liked. It is better to be looked at as a hero, as someone who is an example, particularly in sports. And the reason why in this particular case, I think Jon Jones would benefit from some kind of PR. By the way, he doesn't have good or bad PR. He's got no PR. Okay, it's absent. Tito Ortiz had a public feud with the UFC as well. Now, granted, Jones is better now and is much younger than when Tito Ortiz had his public feud with the UFC. But Tito Ortiz literally saw his ability to draw at the gate and on pay-per-view diminished from how bad the UFC made him look. That is a fact. So I'm not saying that Jon Jones is at that point now. In fact, I think because of what's going on and now the UFC having to turn on a dime and sell him at 152, it's going to be great. But I mean, over the long haul, there is a cost to being slandered. You can't just walk out of that no problem. Win fights, that's the best immunity. And I think he's just going to run over Vitor Belfort, but it is better to be liked in my world.
I don't think Dana's going to slander him long term, though. I can't see. Dana he governs from his emotion a lot, which is a whole other topic for us we may not have time for. But he always gives his legitimate off the cuff reaction, and as we've seen in the last few days, he's sort of pulled back on that and said, I know Jon Jones is going to be around for years, and I've got to deal with him, and I think that's it. To him, this is over. He's got to move on to the next thing. There's always another event. There's always going to be another headache for him to deal with. He can't spend a lot of time worrying about this. I mean, what's in the past? You can't make that money back. It's gone. That's it. It's gone, and now you got to move on. And Jon Jones is going to be there in the future. What good is it going to do him to keep, butting heads with him? They're going to try and fix the relationship, or at least make it as good as it can be as far as moving the company forward.
And that's the one positive thing I think of having Jon Jones fight at 152. You don't let the 151 debacle sort of fester and sit out there.
It's been festering, though.
It's been festering, but they'll have a chance to sort of get it over with. 152 is over, and I think in this sport, the fans and the media, we have very short-term memories. We have to, because a week later there's another event. A week later, Jon Jones is going to be forgotten by the time we get to Rio de Janeiro on October 13th, in my opinion.
And let's say he goes there and just absolutely annihilates Vitor Belfort. At some point, what fans mostly want to celebrate is the fighter, right? They can call him a coward and whatever else about his matchmaking. If he goes out there and just destroys him, like Anderson Silva, this guy was loathed 2 to 3 years ago. You front kick a few guys in the face, fans seem to like you again.
Yeah.
The other fascinating thing to come out of this 151 story, I think, going up to this, I always thought fighters need a union. Fighters need some sort of association. They need something to band together. They need to have a guy like a Tito Ortiz or a Chuck Liddell or a Pat Miletich lead the way, Randy Couture, lead the way and start to come together as one. This showed me that's never going to happen. Every single fighter, it seemed, turned against Jon Jones. When he was trying to stand up and say, listen, I'd take the fight on a month's notice, maybe 4 weeks' notice, 8 days, it's just not professional. I'm not going to do that. Every fighter called him out. Every fighter had their own reason for calling him out. I do believe at this point, it would be great if the fighters unionize or create some sort of association. It's never going to happen. What do you guys think?
I agree with you. I mean, I think there's the guys at the top of the card are the ones that are really necessary to union to make it happen. If the guys at the bottom of the card are guys who are very new to the UFC, try to put this together, those guys are easily replaceable. It's like scabs in other sports. I mean, those guys are the easiest ones to replace. You have to have the guys like George St. Pierre on board and Jon Jones on board and Junior Dos Santos on board. The champions, the ones whose opinions matter with the boss, the ones that when they text Dana, Dana texts them right back. He doesn't wait a day. Those are the ones you have to have on board. And as we've seen, those guys are also the ones that are making the most money. They're the happiest, right?
Right.
Unless they have issues like Jon Jones that are kind of beside the money. But for the most part, these are the guys that are the most satisfied with where they are. So to them, it doesn't make sense to sacrifice a little bit for the common good, even though they maybe were once in that position, even not so long ago. But yes, I mean, certainly a union would benefit these guys. We see in other sports, and MLB, NFL. I mean, the athletes get, I think, something between like 48, 55% of the revenue that the company takes in, or that the league takes in. In this sport, we don't even know how much they take in. Right. We have no clue because those books are not open to the public, and supposedly they're open to the fighters, but I've never heard a fighter say that he's seen the books. I don't know about you guys. Mm-hmm. So how do we know Jon Jones is making enough? How do we know Anderson Silva is making what he's worth? George St. Pierre, because of George St. Pierre, they sold out UFC 129, 55,000 people, $12 million gate. How much of that was his? How much of it does he deserve? He deserves a big chunk, but we don't know if he got what he actually deserves, and we'll never know unless they unionize.
Listen, the benefits to unionization are obvious. I don't know if I would agree with you in saying never happened, but obviously, you see the reactions from Charlie Brenneman and Jeff Hugland tweeting him, being like, "Hey, can we have one of your Jon Bones Jones shirts so my daughter has something new to wear to school?" Yeah, okay, there clearly is not solidarity in the ranks here.
And by the way, that doesn't make those guys look good. I mean, I think they were trying to be sympathetic there.
Yeah.
That kind of makes them look bad as well. No one wants to be looked at.
I don't live their lives. I have a hard time judging any of them. I certainly wouldn't. I don't agree with what they did.
Right.
But whatever. The only thing that bothered me was in the follow-up was like, I bought into it too early, and then I started thinking about it. It was like people asking other champions, would you have taken a fight on 8 days' notice? And every champion, invariably, well, I definitely would have stepped up and been the... Really? Would you? Like, who's gonna say, yes, I would have invited this wave of derision and ostracism and insults and character assassination? Like, to me, part of the reason so many people came out and looked like, and I don't mean just the number of fighters, but like opinion leaders, was your arm was being twisted. This is not a real environment where you're actually asking them what they would prefer. So all I'm saying is, again, I think a union, if it happens, is probably a ways off for the reasons he's described in you as well. I would just leave the door open. I think that there's a little bit of what people say in public and what they really kind of want something to happen behind the scenes.
Do you think they actually need one? Do fighters need one?
Absolutely they need one. And I don't mean one to be necessarily combative, but you look at like any sport. Like if you look at how did unions find their way into baseball? How did unions find their way into football? Unions found their way into baseball because guys who actually were good at unionizing actual labor made their way over into sports, saw how baseball players were being absolutely railroaded and said, this is not fair anymore. And that sport was not what it was today, so it's kind of different. But they made it happen. Now, I don't think UFC fighters are being exploited the way baseball players were when that was going on, but at the same time, the benefits to unionization are clear. The question is it doable? That's a completely separate issue.
One of the other big stories to come out this week was Dana White saying, and I will say in an interview with me on Fuel TV, nice little cheap plug over there, that they are finally settling in on the fact that there could be a GSP versus Anderson Silva super fight. And this is interesting for a few reasons. The most interesting, in my opinion, is that 2 years ago, when there were no contenders at 170 and 185, both of the guys didn't really seem like they wanted this fight to happen. Now, there's a long list of contenders at 170. It's as stacked as it's ever been. 185 is as stacked as it's ever been. And now they want to fight each other. And I kind of feel like it's unfair to the Hendricks, the Catmans, the Weidmans, the Belchers, the Bispings, the Stans, all those guys, that they're going to have to, what they've been shooting for, which is a fight against GSP or a fight against Anderson Silva, they're going to have to sit on ice.
Who cares if it's unfair? We're not in the feelings business, are we?
Mike Chiappetta isn't.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, certainly these guys, once you make it to the UFC, you start working towards something, and you put a couple wins together, and you're trying to get to the top. You're trying to get to a championship level. Obviously, that is the biggest goal. But I think there's always a special set of rules when you're a champion, right? You get to do things a little bit differently. You're on the front of the line and everything. Both of these guys are champions. If they want to fight each other, you have to make way to make that happen. And if the fans want it, most especially.
Right.
Like if that's the fight, people want to see Silva versus St. Pierre more than they want to see Silva versus, Chris Weidman or GSP versus Nick Diaz. I'm just saying, theoretically speaking, right? I think that's pretty well established. People love super fights. Super fights are huge business. Like, this is good for the UFC. If you believe in like a lifting tide rises all boats, which I think is true to some degree in this sport, because a bigger pay-per-view is good for everybody, bigger event is good for everybody, at least the people that are on it. Sure. It's good for the exposure of the company and all those things. You have to make way for a super fight if it is feasible, if it is something that the people want, if it is something the champions want. Because these don't come around very often. They don't, We had to wait for Frankie Edgar to lose at 155 for him to go down and fight Jose Aldo. Sure. We could have seen it before. Now, is it still interesting? Yeah, but not as interesting if they were both the champions and they were meeting at a catchweight. So I think you have to make way for it if it's available.
Yeah, listen, I think it's just part of the climate. You got a lot of UFC shows, and again, I'm not deriding it. FX shows are what they are. They serve a certain function, and they're great. In fact, the last two I thought were pretty good, minus the Clay Guida Maynard thing. But here's the point. You got to really have something today that catches your eye. If you're a casual fan of MMA, a lot's going by. The sports world will stop and watch that. That is a very different kind of fight.
It's an event.
It's a complete event. And it's an event that takes precedence. I mean, I don't know if, listen, football does big ratings, but this would be an event that would stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the biggest sporting events of the year.
You think?
Listen, Super Bowl, no, Right. World Cup, whenever it comes around, no. But it would be in the conversation, particularly in combat sports. And that's the other part. I really think at the end of the day, the UFC understands that all combat sports fans, including boxing, people are dying for a super fight. And I don't think the UFC wants to make a super fight like this after Pacquiao-Mayweather, if it ever happens. It wouldn't have the same luster. If they can beat them to the punch, there's a certain narrative there about being able to make the fights the fans want to see happen. Only thing I would say is, I think if you ask most fans today, it's just my total, conjecture. I have no evidence for this, but, I think most fans want to see Jon Jones, Anderson Silva. I just think GSP Silva is so big. You got to do it while you still can, because they missed that window a couple years ago. Right. It looks like they may have it again. How many times do you get a second chance to make a fight that big? Never.
Does GSP Silva get more pay-per-view buys than UFC 100, which, as far as we know, is
1.6
the UFC record?
I think it'll give it a run for its money. MMA was a little bit bigger back then, it seemed like, at the time, and UFC 100 just caught fire. It was a great card. It was at the right time. This needs to have a lot more things go its way. It needs to get a lot more mainstream attention. It needs to generate that, organically. It has to grow. It almost has to be grown from scratch. UFC 100, for some reason, had a lot of attention attached to it just because it was UFC 100.
Right, just the number.
Right?
Yeah.
Before they even put a card together,
Sure,
what are they going to do for the 100th pay-per-view? It was a big deal before you even had a name attached. Now, obviously, UFC did the right thing and put big names into the event and made it into the, biggest pay-per-view event of all time. This one doesn't have that going for it, but it clearly probably the two most dominant champions in UFC history. I think they're 1 and 2 in terms of all-time title defenses. So you could make a case the number 1 and 2 pound for pound all-time greatest fighters. That's a pretty big draw. And like you said, especially doing it before boxing, I think that's kind of a minor consideration if it happens before.
No, I don't think it's a major thing. Yeah, I think it's in the back of their mind.
To say, these are the two best mixed martial arts of all time. We're putting them together. Still, Anderson Silva hasn't lost, in 15 fights, and GSP hasn't lost since, 2007, whatever. These guys are still in their prime. Dude, that's a super fight.
You put Brock Fedor on the co-main event.
You just took my next question right out of my mouth. Brock versus Fedor. It seemed to me, based on what Dana said in the Fuel TV interview, by the way, check it out.
This guy.
We put the over-under at 4 on Ariel's
it seemed to me like he actually would make this fight. He actually wants, he said, obsession. He used that word. He kind of smirked. It seems to me like if given the opportunity, and I don't really, to be honest, I think he'll have a harder time bringing in Brock Lesnar at this point than Fedor, which is pretty hard, obviously. Yeah. It seems to me like he is still interested in this fight, which says a lot. Do you guys care about it?
No, I don't care.
You don't care?
Listen, if they put it on, would I watch it? Yeah, I mean, listen, I watched Shoot to Brazil, Fight for Bope too, right? I mean, come on. I'll watch. My threshold of watching it is fairly low. I'll watch a house fire. I mean, it's not. I don't care. Listen, it would be all right, I guess, but I mean,
just all right. two icons.
Two guys
of the biggest
who,
icons.
They're retired.
who can't fight anymore.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean,
relative to the standards that we expect for professional,
all right.
modern
But you can't
MMA,
say they can't fight anymore.
Okay, they can fight you and me. That doesn't mean anything. Listen, Brock Lesnar.
I don't know, man.
Listen, Brock Lesnar could probably, if he really put his mind to it, maybe be top 10 again. Maybe not top 5. Certainly top 15.
I think Fedor has a better chance of being top 10 than Brock Lesnar.
I don't think so.
You don't think?
I would give Brock Lesnar
As a light heavyweight.
That's an even tougher division. I don't know about that.
Okay.
But like for example, like think of Czech Congo, right? He's sort of in that top 10 kind of all the time. Brock Lesnar, I could see having his way with Czech Congo for no reason in wrestling. Fedor, I could see him beating Czech Congo. I'd favor him to beat Czech Congo. Do I think it's a lock? I don't think it's a lock. And you can say whatever you want. I see him smirking. His last fight was Pedro Hizzo, tough guy. Yeah, it's not like he's been
Who's available?
Mowing down
Who's
people.
available on the international circuit?
Oh, how about the
for
last
fight?
light heavyweight he fought, who also beat him? But listen, the guy.
Dan Henderson? Oh, that's such an easy fight.
No, but I understand.
What are you trying to say about the old man?
Well, listen, he got beat, on paper he got beat by a 42-year-old, but like, whatever. That's not my point. My point is that the guy is easily the most accomplished heavyweight of all time. I don't think there's any real dispute about that. Maybe some other guys will come up and change that. But for right now, it's Fedor. But he is so far past. I never understood this. It's like, were people begging for Jordan to play for the Wizards? I mean, some people were, but I lived in D.C. It wasn't a glorious moment. When a guy is that good, why would you want to see a cheap facsimile of past glory? I want to see that, and when that's over, I'm happy to see him have the rest of his life.
Yeah, I think for Dana White, Fedor is like his Moby Dick. You know, like he's the guy he wanted for so long. He tried and tried and tried to reel him in, and he just can never do it. And I think that's just something that eats at him. Like he's the one guy the fans wanted to see. You know, he's the one guy that he always had to hear about from the fans. Why can't we get Fedor? Why can't Fedor fight the UFC champion? Why, you know, this was always the guy that was hanging over his head, and he tried so hard to get it done, couldn't make it happen. So it's just something. He's going to have to come to terms with the fact that he never got Fedor. As I agree with Luke that I'm not really too interested in seeing the fight. If they put it together, of course I'd watch, and I'd probably be interested too. By the time the fight came around, I'd probably be like, all right, this is
I'm also sitting here lying.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't want, I don't want to have to drag two guys out of retirement to fight. They're retired. They retired for a reason, right? They didn't retire because they're not making money, or they retired because they both felt that, one of them felt like he wasn't good enough to be at a top level anymore, which is a respectable reason to retire. The other one retired because he wanted to spend more time with his family. Another very respectable reason to retire. Let them have the retirement.
That's
right?
fair.
Why try to pull them back?
The thing that would be frustrating about that fight, at least for me, it'd be like watching Lewis Tyson in 2002. You'd be like, I wish I would have seen this fight a few years ago. But that being said, if they did somehow fight Fedor, even if you fought a giraffe in there, just seeing Fedor in the octagon with the UFC gloves, with Dana next to him, seeing how Dana would, the whole thing would be fascinating. And let's be honest, I mean, look at Mark Hunt's record in Pride, and he got a shot in the UFC. Look what he did there. You're telling me you wouldn't want to see Fedor fight Czech Congo and see what he could do, go on a little run? Who knows? You never know at this point. It's not like he was getting knocked out by Pedro Hizzo. I think it would still be very interesting. You talked about the international scene, who's out there, the free agents, and whatnot. Let's finish on this. This week, officially announced the World Series of MMA, a new promotion. They're trying to do big things. In this climate, 2012 going into 2013, with Zuffa owning, obviously, the UFC, Strikeforce, Bellator doing what they're doing, and then some organization, ONE FC, doing what they're doing, is there even room for a new promotion to come in the North American MMA space and make some kind of splash?
You want to take that first there, Chia?
I was going to say, I think we all have to go into this with the understanding that it's going to be a minor league promotion. We can't come in here thinking that this is going to be a competitor to the UFC just because they have a deal to be broadcast on national television, like they supposedly do. As the time we're taping this, we don't know for sure, but that's what
way to date us.
That's what we're hearing.
Way to date us.
Okay, cut that. But yeah, I mean, I think we have to kind of have that understanding that this is not going to be a major league competitor to the UFC or Strikeforce for that matter. There's just not enough top level talent. There's certainly talent out there in other parts of the world that we aren't familiar with, that are maybe young and on the way up, that they can grab a hold of. Bellator does that a lot. They get a lot of Russian fighters that are very good at a young age, and they try and kind of groom them.
And Brazilian.
And Brazilian. But it's very hard to do, and then also make an impact and let people know how good these guys are. Because I think there's a belief amongst most of the fans that UFC is going to get the top talent. They're the major leagues. Why wouldn't anybody who's a really talented fighter want to go there? it almost doesn't make sense to them that they would choose to go elsewhere if they could go to the UFC. So there's sort of a problem there in terms of just delivering yourself and portraying yourself as a major league caliber promotion.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It's not out of the realm of possibility for a show from its primordial soup to eventually get bigger and bigger and bigger every year, finding a comfortable base.
It's a long journey.
It's a long journey, and then eventually be TV ready. That is not out of the question.
Right.
You can see that. But to go like that to TV automatically tells you that there is a problem here. You just simply can't do it. The other part that's interesting to me is that Steve Cofield, who we know and respect
Never heard of him.
marginally.
Right.
Yeah, he's a zero. But he's a zero who lives in Las Vegas. And he told me that, listen, and they seem to want to make Las Vegas their base. And understandably, it's a fight capital, at least of North America. But the reality is, and his point was, listen, people will come out to the UFC shows when they're big enough, and the Vegas shows are almost always hits. He goes, but they don't have money to go to these other shows. They just don't. $20 maybe, but the ticket prices are 50, 60, 120, 200, 250, which is not, by any means astronomical for what MMA promotions typically charge. They're in trouble. They're not going to be able to fill that thing. So I just feel like if you want to compete in MMA, start humbly and hope for the best and work your way. But to say you're going to shortcut right to NBC Sports, it is an automatic red flag. I wish them the best, but that's a tough road to climb.
The Strikeforce model is the model that I think everyone should try to emulate, right? You start locally, Bay Area, do that kind of thing, develop some talent, the Gilbert Melendezes of the world, get some guys like Kung Lee and guys who did big things in other promotions, Josh Thompson, etc., and then start to grow. But we'll see. We wish them the best of luck, and they make their debut on November 3rd on NBC Sports Network. I want to thank you very much for stopping by, and I really enjoyed it. I think we should do this at least one more time.
Whenever you're not on the road.
Exactly.
Next time I'll grow a beard.
Yeah, exactly.
Please do.
It is the bearded look here. On the MMA Beat, right here on MMAfighting.com. I hope you enjoyed our very first episode, and of course we will be doing many more of these. For Mike Chiappetta, Luke Thomas, I'm Ariel Helwani. Thank you so much for watching.